So today, what I'm going to be presenting on is what constitutes plagiarism in the sciences and why does it matter? And when I say in the sciences, I don't mean that much of this will apply to all disciplines, but specifically, there's some aspects that are specific to the sciences. My name is Tim Meeker. I'm a professor at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Um, my disclosures are that I have no actual or potential conflict of interest in relationship to this presentation. I mean, it's about plagiarism. And the opinions expressed in this presentation are solely my own, don't represent those of any of my funding sources or any of my employer or anybody except for myself. So first, what I want to do is I want to go through several definitions of plagiarism because it is actually a relatively somewhat difficult to define concept. Um, Merriam-Webster definition is to steal or pass off the ideas or words of another as one's own. The use another's production without crediting the source. Um, Oxford English Dictionary says the wrongful appropriation or purloining and publication as one's own of the ideas or the expression of the ideas, literary, artistic, musical, mechanical, etc., of another person. Another. Writing program administrators corporate group um, says that in an instructional setting, plagiarism occurs when a writer deliberately uses someone else's language, ideas, or other original, not common knowledge, we'll define common knowledge later, material without acknowledging its source. The American Psychological Association has a definition stating that there are two common types of plagiarism: the improper use of someone else's words and the improper use of someone else's ideas. Both forms of plagiarism involve using someone else's words or ideas without appropriately acknowledging the author or the source. The National Institutes of Health Office of Research Integrity has a working definition. As a general working definition, ORI considers plagiarism to include both the theft and misappropriation of intellectual property and the substantial unattributed textual copying of another's work. It does not include authorship or credit disputes. These are other types of, can be scientific misconduct, but different parts of science. Finally, Stanford University defines in their honor code for their students, for the purposes of Stanford University honor code, plagiarism is defined as the use without giving reasonable and appropriate credit to or acknowledging the author or source of another person's original work, whether such work is made up of code, formulas, ideas, language, research, strategies, writing, or in other forms. Moreover, verbatim text taken from another source must always be in quotation or within quotation marks. So basically, from these ideas, what you can gather is that you're using it's the passing off or misappropriation or of someone's ideas or words without properly citing them. So this makes sense. Why not plagiarize? Um, well, there's a priority on ideas. So priority means, whoever had the idea first, um, should have credit for the idea. This constitutes intellectual theft. You wouldn't steal someone's property, therefore you shouldn't steal someone's intellectual uh, contributions. Not plagiarizing and having accurate citations encourages the accurate and authoritative exchange of information. This is important for the historical record, so that we can trace the origins and the trajectories of people's thoughts and the evidence and evidentiary uh, the body of evidence of science. Copying someone without attribution is not honoring that person. Now, if you want to honor that person, you can attribute that and you can copy it. But you need to have attribution at minimum, and it should be in quotes if it's not your own language. There are several famous examples of plagiarism. For example, Alex Haley in Roots, the book Roots, in the movie, what eventually became movie, copied sections from The Africans. Bob Dylan in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, apparently there was plagiarism. The New Yorker writer, Jonah Lehrer, also was guilty of plagiarism and admitted plagiarism in his articles on Bob Dylan. So there are numerous varieties of plagiarism, which emphasize different aspects of the term or the problem. So verbatim or word for word plagiarism is exactly what it sounds like. It's using literally the same words as someone else to describe something or to present an idea. There's paraphrase plagiarism, which is plagiarism that is the result of, taking, putting into your own words someone else's ideas and not giving proper attribution. There's inadvertent plagiarism, which basically the adjective here just means that you didn't mean to do it. This does happen, not very often, in fact, though. Um, There's source-based plagiarism where you fail to cite the correct source. And this can happen in a number of ways. The most common way that I've seen it is where someone is reading a review article and they cite the review article, but that idea was not originated in that review article, and the review article actually cited someone else, and you have to go back to that original page. And it can be difficult. It can take time. I know the most recent review we published had 300 odd references, and, going back and tracking all those down takes a lot of time. But it's important that it's accurate as possible. There's data plagiarism, where there's two things where you can either use the same data twice to publish something, which would be data self-plagiarism. And then there is stealing someone else's data, not attributing to them. Um, and then there's finally data plagiarism that is scientific misconduct of falsifying data, which we'll talk about a pretty famous example of that. There's mosaic plagiarism. This really is just a play on mosaicism, and what you end up with is have different phrases from different parts of different papers, and you stitch them together, and you end up with this beautiful paragraph that you had virtually nothing in, you know, no role in creating. And then there's self-plagiarism. So self-plagiarism is when you write something that you've already written, for example, or in a method section, you describe, this method exactly the same way, and it is the same method, but that can be plagiarism, especially considering how often or how long that section is. Um, So there's a plagiarism exception, and that's common knowledge. These are facts that are widely known. Examples of facts that are widely known in the United States would be the date of the Declaration of Independence was signed, undisputed dates of birth of famous figures, the fact that Appomattox is where General Lee surrendered to General Grant in the Civil War. There's also facts widely known within a field. So, for example, the structure of acetone or propanol or ethanol in chemistry would be widely known. Einstein's theory of relativity in physics, for example, and then basic cellular organelles in biology. Ideas or language that is commonly known. This is the second type of common knowledge. This is actually relatively uncommon. If you're in biology or you're writing within the context of biology journals or something like that, the general outline of natural selection and evolution by natural selection in biology would be something that you could assume is something you don't necessarily need to cite unless you're citing some variate or improvement on Darwin's original theory. So, why is self-plagiarism important? Yes, it exists and it's important. It has consequences. It's very common in the introductions and method sections of papers, as well manuscripts, as we'll talk about later. And it's really important that we don't self-plagiarize. One way to not self-plagiarize, especially in the introductions, is to have a different team of writers writing, so like you have different research team, make sure everybody signs off on it, make sure everybody reads it, make sure everybody produces, something for the introduction. It's never going to be the same. And then once you get through reviews, you'll have other things that you have to address, and those will never be the same. So, that should the actual process, which I'll record another video at some point describing the process of writing a paper, frequently will contribute very strongly, especially if you have a team that's working together and you don't have any dominant personalities, for example, or uh, intractable personalities that you're working with, can give you uh, enough ideas and enough um, variety that you don't self-plagiarize. Um, and this comes right down to the pressure to publish. So there's the publisher perish paradigm and social paradigm in science. So you have to publish X number of articles per year, or you're going to not be able to get that grant. You're not going to be able to fund your lab. You're going to have to fire everybody. The whole world can fall apart very quickly. So there's pressure to publish. There are, in fact, consequences to science, for science as a whole, of self-plagiarism. For example, when a meta-analysis comes out, and I've spent several nights measuring error bars to figure out if this is the same group of patients, and is this a different group of patients, or is this a different amalgamation of patients? And so that can be, incredibly difficult for someone trying to do a meta-analysis. And then if that ends up being artificially inflating some role, then the meta-analysis is, on the face of it, problematic. I mean, like it's unfounded. And there's a lot of things where, one study isn't going to tell us everything that we need to know. Um, and then there's the artificial inflation of productivity, which means that if you're the person who's self-plagiarizing a lot and that's your habit and you're like, this is an efficient way of doing things, um, you may be stealing space and time and money from someone who has more creativity or who has a stricter line that they won't cross on self-plagiarism. So it does change the um, playing field. There are frequently personal consequences. Specifically, I know of at least one case where NIH, the National Institutes of Health, prevented someone from grant submissions because they plagiarized their own methods section for a couple of years. So they weren't able to get needed grants. Um, And then there, are frequently requirements to revise manuscripts and in the worst cases to retract manuscript papers. So, and that can tarnish your personal reputation. In the extreme, self-plagiarism results in duplicate publication, which I've seen, and I've seen justified. So where have I seen it? I've seen it in, where there are rare paper patient populations, and they'll present the same data in two different locations. And the justification is sometimes that this is, a publication that's in one language, or the publication is in English, or this is the main publication. And this audience that's going to see the public paper published in another language is not able to see it. So it's a different audience. So that's a justification. And so you have to be very careful, especially when you're doing meta-analyses and looking at the historical record of publications, that you don't accidentally double count things. And, frequently authors don't even say that this has been published somewhere else. So that's one problem that I've run into, for example, on my side at least. I've never duplicated a publication because, one, I don't know what any other languages well enough other than English to publish in. And yeah, I mean, it would be very difficult for me to do that. So let's talk a little bit more about also data plagiarism. So this can be duplication of already published data, like I mentioned with the duplicate publication. And it can be the Research Misconduct Act of making up data. So the consequences, again, personal consequences, grant submission bans if you're found out. And there's a lot of people that are now checking the scientific record, to make sure that we're not getting duplicate publications because they have real world effects, which I'll talk about. Damage to public health, which I'll address at least one potential. And I don't. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of famous um, personality inventory. I think there's a famous personality inventory that is based on largely made up data. Um, and then obviously it results in article retractions because the publisher doesn't want to stand behind an article that um, has been published somewhere else, you know. So there's no priority on the knowledge. You can have damage to your personal legacy as a scientist. I mean, that's very happens quite often. I mean, not quite often, but it happens. Um, so what are some of my tips to avoid plagiarism? One of the easiest tips is to keep track of your major references and the major influences on your writing through a detailed bibliography. And what I normally do is I have a notebook that I keep references in and say, okay, I got this for the most mundane example or most pedestrian example is where, you're like, I'm working on this method. They put injected X amount of drug into this animal. Um, this number of times to produce this model or whatever. And, you have the reference right next to it. Um, in more complicated areas, I've worked on meta-analyses where we have to have, just all kinds of you know, uh, um, a way of grading the evidence for individual papers, forms that we use to analyze those papers, and just all kinds of things. Um, One important point that I love to drive home is, I think it's important to drive home, is don't misrepresent an author's points as supporting your points. I've seen this, and sometimes the language of science is convoluted enough that It's like, well, that supports well, it doesn't. And sometimes there's plain language evidence of that. And people will suspect that if they care about your work, they're going to read it and they're going to, there's going to be consequences. Make sure you've read the latest papers in the field that you're working in. This is very difficult. Um, if you're working in a couple different fields, you'll have 2 to 3 papers in each field, probably at least every month, if not every week, that are important. And then you have your own papers to work on and everything else. So it's a lot of reading. Um, but there are reference software like Web of Science and things like that, online databases that can help with figuring out idea precedents. So did somebody reference this before that, or was it like something that arose spontaneously? Is it a new idea? Use very clear in-text citations when you're writing, so especially when you're drafting. So like one of the tricks that I do is that, I use like EndNote or Reference Manager or Zotero. I've found I found all of those useful at different stages in my career. And those reference manager softwares will allow you to change between styles of references. And I always choose a style like Journal of Neuroscience has, which is basically has the author's last name and then the year that the paper was published. And I'll be able to get to the point where I can actually tell you where that paper is or what the title of the paper is or something close because I've been reading the literature and I can, you know, look at that paper and I know that those ideas line up or I know that they don't line up in my own writing. Rephrase or paraphrase authors to synthesize facts across several sources. So if you're creating a paragraph or a few sentences, it's not useful necessarily just to say exactly what the author said. Um, it's very useful, I find, in promoting, the progress of science to go back and synthesize from different sources what this pathway may be. For example, a molecular pathway, or what this what the pathophysiology of this disorder may be, the underlying pathophysiological mechanism, for example. And if you're thinking like that, then it's easy to avoid plagiarism. One thing you can rely on your own ego here and emphasize your thoughts and conclusions, and what you have brought to the table. And that's important because what you've brought to the table is what people are interested in, um, when they're working with you, if they're really working in science. So there's a little bit of differences across disciplines in plagiarism. In sciences such as biology, chemistry, and physics and psychology, it's the tradition to paraphrase, and you hardly ever see quotes. Often in social sciences, but even more so in law and history, you're likely to see more direct quotations because it's important exactly what the original author said. And it's important to see how the language changed and the language influenced that. Where that gets tricky is when you have somebody that's a biologist or a chemist or something like that trying to work in history of biology or chemistry or something like that. And, then you're trying to synthesize those things and you're like, well, I don't understand why there's so many direct quotes in here because it seems like just a waste of space. I could summarize this much easier. And sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not. It depends on the context. So direct quotations are very rare in science. I've used a direct quotation, I think only once in a publication, and that was in an obituary. So that was a very special case. So what I wanted to do is talk about three case studies of plagiarism. And I'm going to start here with who Retraction Watch has called the most retracted author of all time. The man's name is Joachim Bolt, um, and he's a German anesthesiologist. Um, had more than 400, still has more than 400 publications. Quoting Stephen Schaefer, who's editor-in-chief of Anesthesia and Analgesia and professor at Columbia University, from a 2013 article in BMJ. Bolt was incredibly prolific. He submitted around one manuscript a month to us and other anesthesia journals. Now, I don't know if he was submitting one per month to each, but that would be just even more incredible. So, over a 14-year period, um, he racked up more than 210 retractions. The research that, for example, some of the research that he did that was highlighted by BMJ, this is a British Medical Journal. BMJ was comparing hydroxyethyl starch colloidal solutions to albumin solutions or crystalloids in hypovolemic shock. So if you are in a car accident or you get cut or you get attacked for, you know, examples, and you lose a lot of blood, you can go into shock and die simply because you have lost so much volume of blood. So what you can do sometimes is you can save somebody's life by pumping them full of fluid, and it can't just be water. If it was, deionized water, you would, you know, lyse a lot of their cells, lyse all their blood, you'd kill them ultimately. So basically, what got him caught was that his results were too perfect. And when I say got him caught, I mean like this is important that people not do this, etc. But like it ended up his results were too perfect. And I've seen some comments online where it's like, well, don't point out that his results were too perfect because people then will fabricate data using simulations that make the results look less perfect. And I'm like, if you're writing a simulation to make results that are less perfect, yeah, I get that might be slightly easier than collecting data, but just go out and collect the data. It's a lot of work to do that stuff. There's a lot of work to make up mechanisms that are effectively meaningless. And it's like, what are you doing with your life? Sorry. Um, there appeared to be a perfect acid-base balance after surgery, said Schaefer. No one has ever seen this in the history of the world. And once I saw that, I thought this has to be fake. So, did this have a significant effect on patient health? It may have. We just know what projections are from meta-analyses and things like that. But inclusion of Bolt studies in systematic meta-analyses published in 2013 found significant results or significant effects on results, such that this changed finding from IV hydroxyethyl starch not being associated with decreased mortality compared with other resuscitation solutions. In other words, there's no difference. It's not hurting anybody. It doesn't matter. To hydroxyethyl starch was associated with a significant increased risk of death and acute kidney injury. So Ian Roberts, who was a lead author of a meta-analysis on um, the use of example hydroxyethyl starch, colloidals, and crystalloids for hypovolemic shock, wrote that you know if hydroxyethyl starch had been colloidals had been used in the UK by the NHS, it would probably result in killing between 200 and 300 people every year. So Despite the fact that Bolt's studies were mechanistic in nature, people could misinterpret that as those things being clinically relevant. And since they were made up, there were 68 of his studies were just completely made up because there was no ethics board approval for the studies, and no consent forms and no data. Then, you could be killing people at the extreme, of course. So here's case study number two, and this comes from the Studies in Ethics from the NIH in 2008. So this says plagiarism. No, we're just borrowing better English. So there are two passages here I'm going to read. The first passage is the original passage. One set of neurodegenerative diseases recently linked to ER stress is caused by aberrant metabolism of the widely expressed cell surface glycoprotein PRP. These diseases can be inherited through PRP mutations or acquired via a transmissible agent composed largely of misfolded isoform of PRP termed PRPSC, and this is SC for Scrapie. Exogenous PRPSC is capable of converting the normal cellular isoform, so PRPC, into additional PRPSC, so induced conversion of misfolded protein, leading to its accumulation and generating additional transmissible agent. In the familial diseases, PRP mutations appear to cause accumulation of misfolded PRP through poorly understood mechanisms that in some cases also generate PRPSC. Thus, altered PRP folding, metabolism, and accumulation are the proximal causes of both familial and transmissible prion diseases. However, the downstream events that culminate in selective neuronal death in any of these diseases are unknown. And what I'm going to read next is a passage that borrowed heavily from this. Basically, the scenario has that for example, visiting research professor presents this passage to his boss, and his boss is like, "Look, you really pulled this from this other paper." So I'll read this. So some neurodegenerative diseases recently linked to ER stress have aberrant metabolism of the widely expressed cell surface glycoprotein, PRP. These diseases can be inherited through PRP mutations or be acquired via a transmissible agent composed largely of a misfolded isoform of PRP termed PRPSC. Exogenous PRPSC is capable of converting the normal cellular form PRPSC or PRPC into additional PRPSC molecules, leading to its accumulation and generating additional transmissible agent. In the familial diseases, PRP mutations appear to cause accumulation of misfolded PRP through poorly understood mechanisms. Thus, PRP folding, metabolism, and accumulation are the causes of both familial and transmissible prion diseases. However, the downstream events that lead to selective neuronal death are not known for any of these diseases. So these are really similar. And there are phrases that are completely lifted. And there's at least half a dozen. And I think I don't know that there's an original sentence in this second part. If you assume that the first version is the original. Do you agree that what Dr. X has done is plagiarism? And I think you can only agree. It's quite simple. It's not self-plagiarism. It is plagiarism. There's no citation. There's no effort to, trace where these ideas came from. And none of these ideas are really general knowledge. Usually, one of the things that you can tell with a general knowledge claim is that it's almost never general knowledge that something's not understood. Yeah, because it's in all possible worlds, this is not understood. It's a logical argument, but it does actually work out in the real world. Um, how different do the introductions and different papers from the same laboratory need to be? Well, ideally, you're not focused on least publishable units, and you are focused on, generating, addressing at least different aspects of research questions or entirely different research questions. And typically, I've never run out of research questions. Um, and if you need research questions, let me know because I can give you research questions. And I usually have the data to possibly answer them even. Um, so would it have made a difference if Dr. X had borrowed from a paper from a different laboratory? No. Ultimately, I think stealing from someone else is worse than stealing from yourself, but that's a degree question. Does it make it not plagiarism? No. Could Dr. X reuse his own language in his second paper? Unlikely. And for the reason that I talked about in the second question, basically that you should be addressing something completely novel if it warrants writing a paper. Um, does it make a difference if text is borrowed in writing the introduction to a paper versus the results or the discussion sections? Not really. The introduction is basically setting up. So, like, the first paragraph of the introduction, you may see a lot of similar things because you're basically talking about how important this problem is. But once you get down to, the brass tacks of what research question you're asking and what are the aims of the study, what are you addressing, that all has to be, it should be different by then. Dr. X plans to include a reference to the previous paper. How should he do that? Is this sufficient? Well, he'd have to have a reference for every sentence, basically, and directly to that paper. And it would look kind of stupid. And, it is acceptable if you have multiple references to the same paper in several sentences. Well, I don't say several, I would say a few, two or three sentences to not reference from the first one. So you reference in the first sentence and then you can not reference in the second sentence. That's acceptable. But, it's not sufficient to just reference the previous paper because, again, it's not about whether or not you're not, running the speed limit here. That's not even important. This isn't like well, am I technically correct? What's important is where those ideas came from. And ultimately, ideas come from everywhere. But, you know, if it's not original, then you should be able to find a citation for it. And if it's a sentence and it's a complete thought, it probably has one or at least two sets of evidence because readers need to be able to go back and find that evidence. If Dr. X were writing a review, would the rules be different? No. Um, it's it's just that simple. It's actually worse if you're writing a review, I think. But like again, it's plagiarism. Um, it's like, well, how dead is the person? Did you hit him with a car? Was it an accident? Yeah, maybe that's some mitigating circumstances, but like, you're already going to jail, so hopefully. And now the final case study is from a blog that I saw from May 7th, 2013. 2013 comes up a lot here, which is kind of strange, but I don't know. By um, Dr. Lowe. And I've forgotten his first name, so I apologize, Dr. Lowe. And this is plagiarism. It's just an approach to writing papers. I just loved this. So I'm going to read the retraction notice almost as a, verbatim. I mean, I'm not going to read, the HTML code or whatever. or the HTTP address. But anyhow, the web address. The following article from Chemistry, a European journal, a new indicator for potassium ions at physiological pH by using a macrocyclic luminescent metal complex by Ji Yan, Sasha Liu, and Rong Guo, published online on December 7th, 2012 in Wiley Online Library at that address, and in print in the European in Chemistry, a European Journal, 2013, volume 19, pages 465 through 468, has been retracted as of February 21st, 2013, by agreement between the authors, the journal editor-in-chief Neville Compton, and Wiley VCH Verlag GmbH and Company. The retraction has been agreed due to the fact that the paper was constructed by copying a number of passages from the paper entitled "A Highly Selective Luminescent Sensor for the Time-Gated Detection of Potassium" by Aurore Thibon and Valerie C. Pierre, published in the Journal of the American Chemical Society. The authors apologized for this approach. So they termed it an approach to writing papers, which it's just plagiarism. And I do apologize for any of the names that I butchered there because I'm just from the United States and we don't actually learn multiple languages that well. So comments from Derek Lowe on this on his blog from 2013. And these are verbatim pull quotes. And I thought that these were particularly interesting portions of this. So there are many countries and cultures where it's considered acceptable or at least a venial sin to lift passages verbatim from other English language papers when you're publishing in that language. In parts of Asia, where apparently there's an emphasis in some schools especially in parts of Asia, where apparently there's an emphasis in some schools on verbatim transcription of authoritative sources. This is where I was getting off on don't copying is not honoring. As to contrast this approach, Dr. Lowe says that, at least in his opinion, and I share this opinion, is that a key assumption is that every scientific paper is supposed to be different. If you take the time to read a new paper, you should learn something new and you should see something that you haven't seen before. It might be trivial, it might well be useless, but it should be at least slightly different from any other paper you've read or could find. I agree wholeheartedly with Derek Lowe on this. He still does amazing work. So conclusions. Don't plagiarize. It's real simple. Just don't plagiarize. I can guarantee you that you're going to get caught. If you're taking the time to write something, you should be proud enough of it to be original. You're taking time to write. This is a skill, an important skill that we don't have a lot of left, I think. Proper in-text citations and references or works cited pages are essential to trace the development of ideas. I cannot emphasize this enough. Don't feel like everything needs to be original. Everything doesn't need to be original. It's not going to be, you're going to make an incremental improvement on what has gone before. I've often lamented this and I was, reassured that this is science. It takes a lot of work to add to the body of science. And sometimes you do a lot of work and you don't add to the body of science. That happens all the time. It's important to emphasize your contribution. Now, it's important not just for you, but it's important for the world because your collaborators, your future collaborators, they want to know what you're thinking, how you approach problems, etc. And they want to know that because they want to work with you. Finally, plagiarism detection software is decades old and very good. You will be caught by the software, basically all papers that come to my classes at least. And sometimes I've had to run co-authors sections through plagiarism checkers. Um, will be, verified. We're going to look at it and we're going to check it and it's going to say, well, this part is pulled from here and it tells us exactly where it's from. Um, and if you've got decent software, and then it also can detect whether or not you're using AI or not. I can detect it by reading. It's just because computers don't write the same way as humans write because humans are not computers. Um, and, I think this was another point that Dr. Lowe brought up actually recently is that, large language models are good at doing one thing, and that's predicting the next word that comes first or predicting the word that comes next. And pretty sure that a majority of the words that come out of my mouth are not that easily predictable. Um, you can ask my girlfriend or whoever, my colleagues about that if you're confused. Here are my references. Some of my references are some things I think that were not 100% referenced. But overall, um, yeah, thank you for your time, and I hope that you don't plagiarize. Take care. Take care of yourself and take care of each other.